December 21st, 1944. Belgium. 3 hours before dawn. SS Captain Weavers sat in the commander's hatch of his Jagdpanther, listening. Behind him, in a long column stretching back toward Bullingen, the long, shattered remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division waited in idling half-tracks. Somewhere ahead, up on the frozen ridge, American soldiers of the 26th Infantry Regiment lay dug into foxholes they had been fortifying for 3 days. Weavers had assaulted this ridge before. He knew the drill. The moment his men crossed the line, American artillery would open up with a single warning, round a spotter's guess, landing long or short. Then a second, carefully corrected. Then a third. That predictable pattern was the global language of artillery. Every army on Earth spoke it, providing an attacking force with its most precious asset: time. Time to close the gap. Time to find dead. Zones where the shells could not reach. Weavers had learned this math on the Eastern Front, just like every officer in the German army. The first shot was always a warning, the second, a correction. Real destruction never began until the third, or fourth shell. A fast commander could cover 200 meters in that window. At 5:30, the panzergrenadiers scrambled out of their transports and advanced on foot. Weavers watched them vanish into the shadows, listening closely for the first American spotter shell, that lone distant thud that would start the countdown. But he heard nothing. For nearly the whole minute, the only sounds were crunching boots on frozen dirt and clattering gear. No warning thud, no whistle, no single shell searching for the target. Total silence. Then the entire ridge erupted. No single warning explosion, no testing shots. Every single American gun, and there were over 300 of them standing wheel to wheel, behind that ridge fired simultaneously. The roar did not build. It hit all at once like a falling wall. The valley between the forest and the American lines lit up in a flash of endless explosions. Weaver's young soldiers, 17 and 18-year-old boys, many seeing combat for the first time, were caught standing fully upright. The artillery did not crawl forward in waves like it was supposed to. Instead, the shells rained down everywhere at once, almost as if the Americans knew exactly where the German forces would advance, exactly when they would strike, and had merely waited quietly for the perfect moment to destroy them. Within minutes, the field became a frozen graveyard. The few surviving troops were scrambling back to the forest. A few tanks managed to break through. Heavy armor can survive what human flesh cannot, but they pressed forward completely alone, straight into American lines packed with lethal tank destroyers. By sunrise, 47 German tanks and assault guns lay smoldering, and burial details from the 1st Infantry Division eventually counted 782 dead Germans before the 26th positions alone. If you want to help share these overlooked historical moments with more people, hitting like and subscribing truly helps the channel grow. We appreciate it. Now, what makes that December morning so remarkable isn't just the scale. The Battle of the Bulge is full of horrific mornings. The real shocker is the contrast between what Weavers expected and what actually occurred. He anticipated the universal rules of artillery: warning, adjustment, then full barrage. Instead, he met absolute silence, then instant destruction. No warning, no adjustment, no system at all. And he was not alone. By winter 1944, German officers across the Western Front wrote identical accounts in their after-action reports, repeating the same dark story in Allied interrogation rooms. American artillery simply did not behave like normal artillery. It fell without warning, struck with perfect accuracy, and unleashed so much firepower instantly that the strike ended before a soldier could even drop to the ground. German forces had a name for it, the weapon they could not counter. It was not the Sherman tank they could destroy those, nor was it the fighter bombers, which clouds could easily ground. It was not even the sheer massive size of American forces. What they could never defeat was the silence. That quiet meant every single coordinate on the map was precalculated, every weapon already aimed, and every math problem solved. The only thing left to do was pull the trigger. Once that command was given, there was no warning and no escape. How did the United States Army, which in 1939 ranked 17th in global power behind Portugal, build a system so lightning-fast, quiet, and lethal that Europe's finest army had absolutely no defense against it? The answer starts not on the battlefield, but inside a dusty Oklahoma classroom, specifically the gunnery department. It began with an Army major who decided that traditional artillery methods were entirely wrong. To understand the miracle on that Belgian ridge, we must first look at what did not happen there. To grasp that, you and I need to look at one crucial number: 15 minutes. That was the exact window a German commander relied on when assaulting a position backed by enemy guns. It was a cold calculation built on decades of combat experience across 3 fronts. Let us explore why. Before 1942, in every major army, artillery worked like a conversation. A forward observer spotted a target, then radioed or phoned back to his battery. One battery had 4 to 6 guns. The battery commander ordered a single gun to fire, while the observer watched where the round landed. Too long, he corrected. Another round. Too far left. Another correction. Finally, the 3rd round landed. Close enough. Only then did the battery commander order all guns to fire for effect. That process took about 10 to 12 minutes against a stationary target. Against a moving formation, a battalion crossing a field, or a column on a road, it took even longer because the target shifted before the corrections ever arrived. And every single of those spotting rounds was a telegraph. Each one warned the attacking commander. They see you. They are adjusting. You have time. A veteran infantry officer could read that pattern like a clock. First round long, second round short. Bracket established. Get your men moving before the 3rd shell. This was how artillery worked since the Western Front of 1917. The Germans were exceptionally good at this. Their individual gun calculations were far more precise than anyone else's. They accounted for the unique ballistic fingerprint of each barrel, the temperature of the propellant, even the rotation of the earth. A German battery with time to set up and register its fire was among the most accurate on Earth. But accuracy cost time, and time was a warning. Let us hold that thought, because what happened at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in the early 1930s looks small from a distance. It looks like a bureaucratic reshuffling inside a gunnery department that most of the Army ignored. The military budget had been cut so deep that artillery units trained with wooden shells. The United States Army was a completely neglected institution. 17,000 officers, 130,000 enlisted men, fewer tanks than the police force of a mid-sized city. Nobody outside the Oklahoma plains paid any attention to what a few majors in the gunnery department did with maps and protractors. But here is what Major Carlos Brewer and his successor, Major Orlando Ward, actually did. They asked one single question that no other army had thought to ask. Why does the battery commander need to see where his shells land before hitting the target? Every other army took observed fire for granted. You watch, you correct, and you fire. Brewer asked, what if we make the math good enough that the first round lands on target? What if we calculate so precisely, finding gun positions by survey instead of guesswork, target locations from map grids rather than some terrain description? With corrections for weather, temperature, altitude, and barrel wear pre-computed and filed, so that when the order comes, you fire for effect immediately. No spotting round, no correction, no conversation, no warning. They built a centralized fire direction center, the FDC. Instead of each battery calculating its own fire independently, one single center controlled all the guns in a battalion. Then, those battalions could be linked to a regimental FDC, regiments to a division, and divisions to a corps. One lieutenant with a radio and a map. Coordinate could, in theory, summon the concentrated fire of every gun in range. Not after 15 minutes of adjustment, but in 3. No other army on Earth built anything like this. Not the Germans, whose precision was legendary. Not the British, whose artillery at El Alamein was devastating. Not the Soviets, who simply buried their enemies under sheer tonnage. This fire direction center above battery level was a purely American invention, changing the arithmetic of every battle it touched. But in 1941, it remained a theory, tested on ranges, proven in exercises, never fired in anger. The real question was whether it would work when the shells were real, maps were foreign, and the men behind the guns were 20-year-olds who had been civilians just 8 months earlier. The answer came in a place nobody expected, not Normandy, nor even Europe. It came in the Tunisian desert in February 1943, at a pass called Kasserine. And the answer, at first, was no. What happened at Kasserine nearly destroyed the American artillery revolution before it even started. What followed in the 6 months after Kasserine is one of the most remarkable institutional recoveries in military history. February 19th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The German assault came through the pass in textbook fashion. Rommel's panzers and the battle-hardened troops of the Afrika Korps hit raw American units that had never been in a real fight. Within hours, the American line shattered. Infantry broke and fled. Tank battalions were destroyed, piecemeal, and the artillery, the system that Fort Sill spent a decade building, collapsed. Not because the theory was wrong, but because American artillery batteries were scattered across miles of desert without coordination. There was no proper survey data. Communications were a total mess phone line severed by shells, radios on the wrong frequencies. Forward, observers were killed or overrun before transmitting a single coordinate. Battalion fire direction centers, which were supposed to coordinate fire, could not organize anything because they did not know where their own guns were located. The entire beautiful system of predicted fire collapsed into the exact chaos it was designed to replace. Individual batteries were firing independently. Each one was guessing, and each one was slow. Rommel's artillery, meanwhile, worked exactly as advertised. German spotters adjusted their targets with deadly, practiced efficiency. German shells walked right onto American positions with that familiar pattern spot, correct, and fire for effect. It was a bitter irony. The army that reinvented modern artillery was outgunned by the force that had not. Over the next 3 days, the Americans lost nearly 6,000 men, 200 tanks, and what remained of their confidence. German intelligence reports were highly dismissive. One assessment noted that American soldiers showed very poor discipline under fire, and that their officers seemed unable to coordinate combined arms. The word they used most often was unmethodish, unmethodical. Let's focus on one key detail here, because it is going to matter a lot later. The Germans were right about Kasserine. The Americans in February 1943 were exactly as bad as the Germans said they were. That's not the best part. Subscribe to the channel to see more, because what happened next was insanely fast. Within weeks, American commanders were analyzing Kasserine with a ruthlessness that became a weapon in its own right. After, action reports were gathered, studied, and shared, cataloging every failure with the sheer obsessiveness of an engineering firm investigating a bridge collapse. And the fixes were not theoretical. They were highly specific, concrete, and they reached the front lines in weeks, not months or years. The artillery problems at Kasserine came down to 3 failures: position, communication, and speed. Batteries did not know exactly where they were. Observers could not reach FDCs, and FDCs could not compute firing data fast enough. Position was solved by survey teams, crews moving ahead of the guns to establish precise grid locations before the batteries arrived. This was dull, painstaking work that nobody would ever make a movie about, but it meant that when a battery set up in a new position, the FDC already knew its location to within a few meters. Communication was solved by more radios, not better ones. The SCR-300 backpack radio, made by Galvin in Chicago, had just started making weighed 32 pounds with a 5-mile range. The Army pushed them down to company level, then to platoon. Then, and this is the part the Germans never understood, they trained every officer and every senior sergeant in how to call in artillery support. Not just the forward observers, but everyone. If the FO was killed, the platoon sergeant simply picked up the radio and called in the strike using the exact same coordinates, the same format, the same language. In the German army, if an artillery observer died, the link between the infantry and the guns died with him. In the American army, the connection was the system itself. Speed was solved by a slide rule. Like this video, and remember Lieutenant Colonel Abbott Burns, who was a month away from a telephone company job in Arizona before being sent to an FDC. Burns sat there night after night, staring at thick books of logarithmic firing tables, pages of numbers that an FDC crew had to look up, cross-reference, and calculate by hand every time a fire mission came in. The math was accurate, but also slow. 3 minutes was the target. Under stress, with tired men and shaking hands, it took much longer. One night, in November 1940, Burns cut a paper strip and marked it with a scale. On one side, ranges. On the other, elevations, precalculated for specific powder charges and weather conditions. He laid the strip between 2 points on his map, the battery position and the target, reading the firing data directly. No more logarithms, no cross-referencing, no books. Major George Kaiser, the only officer who did not dismiss the idea, helped Burns refine it into a working tool. A wooden device the size of a ruler, featuring sliding scales calibrated for every combination of weapon, charge, weather, and altitude an American soldier might face. They called it the Graphical firing table. It cost $1.50 at the Fort Sill bookstore. It looked like something a high school student would build for a science fair, and it cut the time from the initial request to shells hitting targets to under 3 minutes, consistently, reliably, even when the man reading it was awake 30 hours. By summer 1943, every FDC in North Africa had one, but nobody outside the artillery knew what it meant not yet. It took a battle in Sicily for the Germans to hear the first silence and to finally understand that everything had changed. What they actually heard on that island, or rather, what they did not hear, would rewrite the math of the Western Front. But the tool responsible was not a weapon, but a $1.50 ruler. July 10th, 1943, Sicily. The invasion was barely 4 hours old when a German counterattack rolled toward the American beachhead at Gela. The Hermann Göring Division, one of their best equipped armored formations the Germans had in the Mediterranean, pushed Tiger tanks and panzergrenadiers straight down the Gela plain toward the beach, where men of the 1st Infantry Division were still unloading from landing craft. The situation was exactly what Kasserine had taught Americans to dread. Armor in the open, American infantry without enough anti-tank guns, and nowhere to retreat except the sea. But this was not February, this was July, and the artillery that came ashore with the 1st Division had been rebuilt from the wreckage of Kasserine in 5 months. The batteries were surveyed in, the fire direction centers were linked, radios worked, and when forward observers saw German armor coming down the plain, the call went out in a new language, a 6-digit grid coordinate, a target description, a request for battalion fire. What happened next was something the Hermann Göring Division had never experienced before. Shells did not arrive one by one, searching. They arrived in clusters, a full battalion of 12 guns, firing simultaneously on a single coordinate. The first rounds landed among the lead tanks. No corrections were made because none were needed. The firing data had been computed from maps, adjusted for weather, and read off a wooden slide rule costing less than a pair of boots. The Germans pulled back, reformed, and attacked from a different direction. Another coordinate, another call, another battalion salvo within 3 minutes. They fell back again. Attacking a third time, the Fire Direction Center did not send one battalion. It sent 336 guns from 3 different positions, all converging on the same grid square. The counterattack broke. The Hermann Göring division lost a third of its tanks that day, and the American beachhead held. The German after-action report from Gela noted something puzzling. The American artillery had responded incredibly fast, and without the usual preliminary adjustments. The report suggested the Americans had advanced intelligence of their attack routes. They had not. They had a slide rule and a system. Over the next 12 months, through Sicily, Salerno, and the Italian campaign, their system grew teeth. Each battle taught the fire direction operators something new. They got faster, more aggressive, and they developed a technique that turned the German calculations not just wrong but lethal. It was called time on target. The idea was simple to describe, but nightmarishly difficult to execute. Multiple batteries, sometimes from different battalions or even different divisions, would fire at staggered intervals, calculated so that every shell from every gun, fired from different distances, hit the target at the exact same instant, not within the same minute, but the same second. If we imagine being on the receiving end of this, standard artillery, even massed fire, has shells arriving in a ragged sequence. The first explosions give soldiers maybe 2 seconds to react, enough time to drop flat, roll into a trench, or press against the earth. Post-World War I studies showed that within 8 seconds of the first impact, almost every soldier was flat and under some kind of cover. Casualties dropped sharply after that. Time on target erased those 8 seconds. If 60 shells from 20 guns arrive in the same heartbeat, there is no warning blast. Only total silence, followed instantly by everything at once. A soldier standing upright when the volley arrives is still upright as the shrapnel passes right through him, because there was absolutely no gap between warning and death. And here's what terrified the German officers who survived. There was no warning noise, no distant thump of artillery, no whistle of an incoming shell to give soldiers half a second to react. Shells from the nearest battery, and those 7 miles away, were timed to cross the sky in absolute unison. Hit like and subscribe to support the channel. The first thing they heard was the detonation, silence, then annihilation. That was the new language. In Italy, the Germans had to adapt, as they always did, because the Wehrmacht was highly adaptable. They began to disperse their formations. They dug deeper, moved only at night, and placed command posts in basements and supply routes in deep ravines. These were smart tactics that worked to a degree. A scattered unit is harder to hit, but far more difficult to coordinate. Deeper fortifications protect troops, but slow reaction times. Night movement avoids observation, but halves the distance covered. Every single countermeasure against American artillery came with a heavy cost that slowly accumulated. By the time the Allies planned the invasion of France, German commanders in Italy had developed a specific and history documented a deep fear. Not of American tanks, those were manageable, nor of infantry, whom the Germans still considered their own soldiers superior to. Their true dread was silence, the eerie quiet preceding a synchronized artillery strike, the awe silence that meant a soldier's position was already plotted, their grid coordinates computed, and every gun within 15 miles was aimed directly at them. That quiet meant talk between observer and battery was replaced by cold, calculated mathematics, completely indifferent to whether those men were moving or standing still. Field Marshal Irwin. Rommel, assessing Allied strengths in Italy before taking charge of the Atlantic Wall defenses, wrote a single sentence that held more strategic truth than volumes of military analysis. He wrote, "The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery has broken the front wide open." He made no mention of tanks or aircraft. He only mentioned the devastating guns. Yet Rommel only knew part of the story, because the system he feared in Italy was about to face a weapon he had never encountered. A technology so secret that the Pentagon banned its land use for 2 years, terrified that German forces might capture a unit and copy the design. A technology that turned the silence from terrifying to completely unsurvivable. By December 1944, it earned a nickname. American artillerymen called it the funny fuse. The Germans had no nickname, describing it simply as the thing that exploded before hitting. To understand this incredible fuse, let's look at a problem that artillerymen had been cursing since the Napoleonic Wars. A shell that detonates on impact is highly wasteful. The blast digs a crater, throwing shrapnel upward and outward, meaning the ground absorbs most of its destructive energy. A soldier lying flat in a shallow trench, even a simple scrape in the earth, remains mostly protected from a ground blast 10 yards away. This meant the lethal geometry was entirely wrong. The blast directed its force upward instead of targeting the soldiers below. The solution had been known for over a century. Detonate the shell in midair, 20 to 50 feet up, letting shrapnel rain downward. An airburst turned every single fragment into a projectile targeted at the earth. A soldier lying prone, a man taking cover in a foxhole, or a crew behind a wall, were suddenly exposed from above. The lethal radius doubled. Under certain conditions, it tripled. The obstacle was timing. Before 1943, producing an airburst required a mechanical time fuse, a tiny clockwork mechanism inside the nose of the shell, hand-set prior to loading. The gunner calculated the estimated flight time, dialed that exact duration into the fuse, and hoped. If that calculation was off by mere fractions of a second, the shell detonated uselessly high or slammed directly into the ground, wasting the airburst completely. In reality, these time fuses proved so unreliable that most field commanders avoided them for standard missions, relying on them only for pre-planned barrages where target distances were precisely measured. For everything else, commanders relied on impact fuses and accepted the limitations. In August 1940, shortly after France fell, a Navy captain named Gilbert Hoover met with researchers from the National Defense Research Committee to ask a seemingly impossible question. Could engineers actually design a fuse containing a miniature radar system, a radio transmitter and receiver built small enough to fit inside the nose of an artillery shell, yet rugged enough to endure being fired from a cannon at 5,000 g-forces of acceleration, and smart enough to detect the approaching ground and detonate at the right height? The researchers admitted they did not know. Then they spent 3 years finding out. The development was a nightmare. Glass vacuum tubes, the sole amplification technology of the era, shattered under firing forces. The team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, operating under a program designated Section T, had to design tubes small enough to fit within a shell casing and resilient enough to withstand pressure that would pulverize a wristwatch. They tested thousands of designs, and most failed. The survivors were eventually built by firms that manufactured holiday lights and jukebox components, including General Electric, Crosley, Eastman, Kodak, and Sylvania. By 1943, they possessed a working fuse for naval anti-aircraft artillery. The Navy deployed it first off Guadalcanal in January of that year when the cruiser Helena fired 3 shells at an escaping Japanese warplane, knocking it out of the sky without even securing a direct strike. The projectiles merely passed close enough for the onboard radar to detect the target and detonate. Yet, this fuse, which struck terror into pilots in the Pacific, was kept off European battlefields for nearly 2 years. If we analyze the Pentagon's reasoning, it was sound but ruthless. If an unexploded shell landed in occupied territory, German engineers would dissect it, discover the miniature radar, and quickly reverse engineer it or develop effective countermeasures. The risk remained too severe. Naval deployment over open water was allowed since duds sank, but land use was strictly prohibited. In the autumn of 1944, 200,000 proximity-fused artillery shells sat waiting across France and Belgium. They fit every American gun, from 105mm howitzers to massive 240mm heavies, ready but locked away by direct orders, while American troops bled in the Hurtgen Forest and the Siegfried Line using the exact same impact fuses from 1918. Then, on December 16, 1944, Hitler threw 25 divisions into the Ardennes, striking the thinnest part of the American line, the 99th Infantry Division, a green unit posted to this quiet sector precisely because nothing was supposed to happen here. Within hours, panzers poured through massive gaps. Outmatched American units found themselves surrounded, overrun, and annihilated. Near Monschau, on the critical northern shoulder, the 38th Cavalry Squadron, lightly armed scouts, never meant for heavy combat, stood directly in the way of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. Colonel Oscar Axelson, commanding the 405th Field Artillery, had received the secret shells 2 weeks earlier with strict instructions. Do not fire without authorization from SHAEF. Eisenhower himself had not yet cleared them for combat. The crates remained stacked behind the guns, each one stamped with the secret name Posit, containing a tiny radar transmitter, no larger than a thimble. Axelson watched the 38th Cavalry's defenses buckle. Those troopers had only rifles, machine guns, and light armored cars. The Volksgrenadiers brought heavy artillery, assault guns, and an entire division. Without immediate support, the cavalry would be crushed in under an hour, and the vital northern flank of the American line, which guarded the roads to Liège and eventually to Antwerp, would break wide open. Axelson stared at his orders, then at the crates. He ordered them opened. What occurred over the fields of Monschau during the next 60 seconds had no equal in the entire history of warfare. And the German troops caught beneath those shells had no idea what was killing them because no army had ever faced such a terror. The weapons screamed from the gun tubes like ordinary artillery. They raced through the freezing sky at the same speeds, on the same precise paths, following normal ballistic arcs. But inside each nose cone, something brand new was alive, a tiny transmitter powered by a battery that activated only at the moment of firing. The violent acceleration crushed a glass ampule of electrolyte, launching a continuous radio signal bouncing directly off the frozen earth and returning to a receiver coiled inside the shell. As the deadly weapon fell, the gap between signal and return shrank. At a preset threshold, roughly 30 feet, above the ground, the electronic fuse triggered. The projectile never touched the dirt, detonating in midair above the Volksgrenadiers of the 326th. Not just one shell, but dozens, bursting at the precise height that unleashed a lethal storm of jagged metal downward. A soldier lying flat in the snow, a pose that had saved lives, from normal ground-burst artillery for a century, was now exposed directly to a downpour of shredding shrapnel, moving at thousands of feet per second. Foxholes were useless without overhead cover, and the Volksgrenadiers were attacking, not dug in. They stood upright in the open, moving across a frozen field toward the American troopers at Monschau. They never got close. The assault halted, not gradually, but instantly. It stopped as though a switch had been flipped. Surviving Germans retreated into the trees. The 38th Cavalry held. The northern shoulder stood firm. Axelson filed his report and braced for a court-martial for violating a direct order he never was. 3 days later, on December 19th, Eisenhower demanded all limits on the proximity fuse be stripped away immediately. By December 21st, every American artillery crew in the Ardennes had the Posit shells. This timing was disastrous for the Wehrmacht because by December 21st, the battle that mattered most on the northern flank raged far from Monschau. It was 5 miles south, on a frozen ridge above Dombuchenbach, where the 12th SS Panzer Division, teenage conscripts in gray uniforms, former Hitler Youth children turned into soldiers, was hurling itself against the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division. Now, let us examine the clash we witnessed earlier. Together, we finally have the context to understand what those panzergrenadiers truly walked into. It wasn't just 300 knot, guns firing time on target. It wasn't just predicted fire without registration, it was all of that, plus Shells that detonated 30 feet above the mud, transforming every square meter of open field into a lethal killing zone that no posture, cover, or speed could escape. 10,000 rounds fell on December 22nd alone. 782 dead Germans lay in front of just one regiment. 47 tanks lay wrecked. If you want to understand the true horror, consider this single chilling detail. Not a single panzergrenadier on foot actually reached the American foxholes. Their tanks broke through because steel can absorb what human flesh cannot. But the infantry trailing behind, the soldiers tasked with clearing trenches and holding the ground, were cut down in the open by devastating airbursts in the quiet moment before total annihilation. 5 days later, in 60 miles southwest, the proximity fuse made its mark in a legendary report that General George Patton would make famous. His Third Army trapped a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. Enemy troops bunched along the banks, climbing into boats or waiting in the shallows. Suddenly, American artillery opened fire using those specialized posit fuses. The shells detonated in a deadly canopy of steel right over the river. When Graves' registration teams searched the banks later, they counted 702 bodies. Patton sat down and wrote to Major General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Army Ordnance. He wrote that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating, predicting that once everyone got it, we would have to invent a completely new way of fighting wars. He was right, but that new method was already taking shape. Not among high-ranking generals, but among the German survivors of those terrifying airbursts. At Malmedy, during a massive German assault, American batteries unleashed proximity-fused shells directly into the advancing enemy formations. Intelligence records revealed a shocking aftermath. Trapped between deadly airbursts exploding directly ahead of them, and their own officers threatening them from behind, desperate troops charged straight toward American lines, screaming "Kamerad," the German word for surrender. They actually ran toward the guns, because surrendering was safer than retreating back under those air bursts. German commanders reacted with the same disciplined efficiency that made the Wehrmacht formidable, issuing an urgent order. Any soldier who retrieved an intact proximity, fuse a dud, an unexploded shell, or anything containing the delicate trigger would receive a massive reward. They wanted to dissect it, copy it, and find a direct countermeasure. They never succeeded, but not because the engineering was too complex. German scientists had actually been working on similar radar concepts since 1939. They failed because the fuse itself was not the ultimate weapon. It was merely the final layer of a massive network, starting with a survey team mapping coordinates and ending with a tiny thimble-sized radar exploding a shell in midair. Without the fire direction center, that fuse was just a neat trick. Without pre-computed firing data, the fire direction center was just an empty office. And without radios allowing a sergeant to call in heavy artillery, the math was completely useless. Separately, these elements did nothing. But together, they created a force the German military could never defeat. There was also one final piece, something no amount of enemy engineering could copy, the one element that made this entire network function. Make sure to subscribe. It had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with trust. With the Germans, artillery was a specialist's weapon. The forward observer was a highly trained expert attached to an UNDA infantry unit, but reporting directly to the batteries. He was the only connection between frontline soldiers and the big guns hidden behind from the hills. He carried a heavy radio, or, far more frequently, relied on a thin telephone wire snaking through the mud back to the command bunker. If that wire was severed by enemy fire, which happened all the time, the infantry was cut off from its fire support until someone crawled out to fix it. If the observer was killed and they died at an incredibly high rate, the troops had no artillery cover until a replacement could make it to the front lines. That process could drag on for hours, even days. The method succeeded only because these German observers were exceptional, undergoing incredibly long and brutal training. Their targeting was flawless, and their relationship with the battery commanders was forged through years of shared tactical doctrine and relentless drilling. Yet, this system had one fatal flaw, a single point of failure: a human being. The American setup was designed on a completely different philosophy. They did not dismiss specialists. American forward observers were highly skilled and extensively trained. However, the system's creators back at Fort Sill had asked a critical question that sparked a massive cultural revolution inside the ranks. What happens when your observer is killed? The German command said you wait. The American command said you train everyone. By 1944, it was official doctrine in the American Army to teach every officer, whether in infantry, armor, or engineering, exactly how to call in artillery support. They learned the actual complex procedure, giving precise 6-digit coordinates, target descriptions, and the exact type of fire requested, spoken clearly into an SCR 300 radio on the artillery frequency. Many senior sergeants received this identical training, and even some corporals did too. Deep in the Normandy hedgerows, official reports show times when every single officer and non-commissioned officer had been wiped out, leaving a 20-year-old buck sergeant to grab the radio, read coordinates off his map, and rain a full battalion of 105s right onto German positions just 400 yards away, because he was an artilleryman who had simply been taught the words. In his historical account of the fighting in Normandy, one historian noted that the technique was so straightforward that even an inexperienced enlisted soldier could easily be guided through the procedure over the radio, which actually happened on several occasions when all their officers had fallen. Let's consider what this meant for a German company commander planning an attack. Under the old rules of warfare, they studied the terrain, identified likely observation posts, and calculated which hilltops had a clear line of sight to their axis of advance. If they could blind the observer, suppress him, or cut his wires, they bought themselves precious time. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe even more. Time in which their men could cross open ground without the sky collapsing on them. In this new arithmetic, the observer was everywhere. Every single American soldier with a radio and a map was a potential spotter. Every hilltop, every hedgerow, and every shell crater harboring a soldier who could read a grid coordinate became a pair of eyes, connected to 300 guns. German forces couldn't blind the observer because there was no single target to blind. The observation network spanned the entire front line, and the radios used FM. This was a detail that mattered more than it. German Army used AM radios, amplitude modulation, which were highly susceptible to static, interference, and interception. The American SCR 300 used frequency modulation, designed by Daniel Noble at Galvin FM. Signals were clearer, harder to jam, and tougher to intercept. A German signals unit could listen to AM traffic and triangulate the transmitter's position. FM was a completely different problem. The American observer could call fire from a foxhole, and the Germans couldn't reliably find, track, or silence him. Hit-like as we look through the eyes of a German officer on the Western Front in the winter of 1944, he had been fighting the Americans for 6 months. He knew certain things. He knew that somewhere across the field, in positions he could not see, there were men, without him knowing how many or where. He knew that any one of those soldiers could speak a few words into a handset, and within 3 minutes, sometimes far less shells would rain down on his position without warning, without spotting rounds, without the old grammar of correction that used to buy him time to escape. He knew those shells could now explode in the air above his head, turning his foxhole from a shelter into a trap, and he knew that even if his own artillery silenced one observer, another would take his place, because the Americans had trained virtually every man in the company to do the job. What did he fear? Not the guns. He couldn't see them, he couldn't hear them until the shells were already in the air. He couldn't count the guns because time on target made 30 sound like 300. What he feared was the silence. That silence meant someone was watching. It meant coordinates were being read into a radio. The silence meant that in the next 3 minutes, or the next 30 seconds, he didn't know which the deadly mathematics that began in a classroom in Oklahoma and were refined on a $1.50 slide rule would reach out across miles of frozen countryside and find him. The silence meant he was already targeted. He just didn't know it yet. This is what German officers meant when they wrote time and again in report after report and interrogation after interrogation that the American artillery was the one force they could never counter. Not because the shells were larger or because there were more of them, but because the silence preceding them was absolute and the system behind them was completely invisible. The men operating it were not specialists who could be targeted, but an entire army that had been trained to call down fire the way other armies taught men to load a rifle. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a culture, and cultures cannot be reverse engineered. December 23rd, 1944, Dom Buchenbach. The morning after the close die, last assault was quiet. A genuine silence this time, not the calculated pause of an artillery system waiting to strike, but snow had begun to fall overnight, blanketing the field between the tree line and the American foxholes, filling craters and settling on the motionless shapes across the frozen ground, 782 of them. Some were frozen in mid-run, others huddled over wounds that the medics of the 12th SS never reached. Many were so young that the graves registration teams from the 1st Division, hardened veterans who had fallen from North Africa to Normandy, simply stopped, stared, and said nothing. The men of the 26th Infantry stayed in their foxholes. They had held the ridge for 4 days against everything the 6th Panzer Army could throw at them. They were filthy, freezing, many of them wounded, and most operating purely on cold rations and lingering adrenaline. Behind them, more than 300 gun tubes stood in rows so tight they almost touched. The artillery of the 1st Division, the 99th Division, and the entire 5th Corps represented the greatest concentration of American firepower on the Western Front. An entire division, the massive 5th Corps, stood as the greatest concentration of American military power on the Western Front. Gun crews slept beside their weapons in the freezing snow, surrounded by heaps of spent brass casings. Tens of thousands of empty shells, the physical residue of a system designed by 2 majors a decade earlier. In an Oklahoma classroom, they built this blueprint. The German forces never struck Elsenborn Ridge again. On December 26th, the 246th Volksgrenadier Division launched one final hopeless charge. Conscripts crossed the line only to be annihilated by artillery before they marched 100 yards. That sealed the northern shoulder of the Bulge, keeping the roads to Liege and Antwerp in American hands. The 6th Panzer Army, the spearhead of Hitler's final offensive, bled itself white against that stubborn ridge. Colonel Oscar Axelson faced no court-martial for firing those secret shells without official authorization. Instead, he was quietly commended. His dark decision at Malmedy to open the crates and break orders to save the 38th Cavalry over protecting a military secret was exactly what the American system intended. It valued judgment at the lowest level over blind obedience to the chain of command for its own sake. A leader on the battlefield understood the immediate threat far better than any remote military headquarters 50 miles away. The same rule, letting a sergeant call a corps barrage, allowed a colonel to open secret ammunition crates. The Army trusted its men, and they trusted it back. Abbott Burns, who created the first graphical firing table from paper because he was tired of looking up logarithms, survived the war. So did George Kaiser, who saw in that strip a unique device that would compress minutes of calculation into seconds. Their weapon of silence, a simple wooden slide rule, was never classified, never celebrated, and never named. Instead, it sat in the Fort Sill bookstore, nestled between field manuals sold to anyone for $1.50. This was perhaps the most consequential piece of military technology that almost no one has ever heard of. Carlos Brewer, the major who first asked why a gunner needed to see his shells land before hitting the target, retired as a brigadier general. Orlando Ward, who built the Fire Direction Center, commanded the 1st Armored Division in North Africa. later serving as chief of military history. Neither became famous. Their names are absent from popular history, yet the firing system they designed broke the German Bulge, terrified Rommel in Italy, and killed 702 enemy soldiers along the Sauer River in a single volley. It bore no inventor's name or patent. This was an institutional weapon, belonging to everyone and no one. As for the Germans, after the war, American intelligence teams sat down with captured officers and asked them, methodically, what they feared most. The answer was not what you and I might expect. They did not fear a specific general. Their consistent answers told a story. It was not the Sherman tanks, which were inferior to Panthers. They did not fear the infantry, whose training was far superior. German small unit tactics were better, inflicting 50% more casualties than they suffered. Nor was it the fighter bombers, despite being hated. Bad weather grounded planes, and German troops moved under low cloud cover. What they truly feared was the artillery, and their terror was not born of the deafening noise. It was the silence before the storm. No spotting rounds, no warning sirens, no advance notice whatsoever. This shattered the traditional military rules used since the first cannons fired. It was the quiet work of a system so complete that it eliminated the gap between detection and destruction. An observer merely whispered coordinates. The fire direction center read a slide rule. Crews pulled lanyards, and across frozen fields, shells fell. Shrapnel exploded 30 feet above men who never heard it coming. They feared that American silence. It meant the Americans were not currently aiming, they had already aimed, waiting for soldiers to step into coordinates mapped out hours, days, or even weeks before. By the time of the blast, the calculations were complete, and the decision was final. Only physics remained. That is what institutional trust sounds like. To the enemy, it sounded like nothing at all. If you stayed with this historical journey this far, thank you. It truly means a lot. If this revealed something new or simply reminded you of history, please consider hitting that like button today. It is a simple gesture, but it helps these deep histories reach eager minds. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time to join our community. Turn on notifications, tell us your location in the comments, and share this with family history buffs. If your relatives fought in the Second World War, please like the video and tell us about them. These histories belong to real people, and our channel is full of history fans waiting to hear yours.